Hello, guys and gals, and this is part 8 of our reading of Rod Serling's Twilight Zone, 26 Unforgettable Explorations into the Realm of the Supernatural, adapted by Walter B. Gibson. Now, as always, we're going to go over the copyright information, and that should be on the screen right now. Let me find it in the book first. Did I miss it? Oh, here it is. It says, Rod Serling's The Twilight Zone is copyright 1963 by Cayuga Publications Incorporated. Rod Serling's Twilight Zone Revisited, copyright 1964 by Cayuga Productions Incorporated, all rights reserved. This 1983 edition is published by Bonanza Books, distributed by Outlet Book Company, a Random House company, and it gives all of the different companies there. This book was previously published in two separate works entitled Rod Serling's The Twilight Zone and Rod Serling's Twilight Zone Revisited. Printed and bound in the United States, gives all the Library of Congress numbers and all that information if you're into that. And we were reading the story, The Ghost Town Ghost. Now, I don't know if we'll get it done in this part, but we're going to continue where we left off if I can find that. I don't remember exactly where we were when I left off because it's been a while. We're going to go back to this one where he talks about the mirages because I find that really interesting. So let's continue where we left off. Because that's where you will see mirages, nice blue lakes and green woods, sometimes even towns. The mountains look so far away when the mirages look so close, they fool you. But it's twice as far up the desert as it is across. People who head north are never heard from again. Jim saddled Lubeck, packed a bag of sample ore from the mine, hung his canvases on his saddle, and filled his canteen. I'll take 3 days' supply of food, Jim told Bert. That will leave you enough to stay home and work the mine until I get back. A few hours later, Jim Gilbert was riding across the desert, finding it easy going with a good horse like Lubeck, though rather monotonous. Giant saguaro dominated the scene with occasional traces of a roadway among them. The water holes, however, proved dry at this season. When Jim finally made camp at one, he found barely enough water for Lubeck to drink his fill. The second day proved worse, but Jim kept steady on his course and felt sure that he and his sturdy horse could stave off the ravages of thirst long enough to complete their crossing of the desert. At noon they reached another waterhole, but found it totally dry. Jim dismounted and took the horse along by the bridle while they both studied the situation. Then patting Lubeck, Jim said, "We'll have to try next place, old fella." With that, Jim gripped the pommel of the saddle and raised one foot to the stirrup. It was then that Lubeck gave a whinny and began to rear. At the same instant, Jim heard a warning rattle from the ground. He wheeled around, drew his revolver, and blazed away at a snake that was starting to strike at the horse. The shots made short work of the rattler, but when Jim turned to mount his horse, Lubeck was gone. Utterly terrified by the rattlesnake, the horse had galloped off into the desert, leaving only a trail of dust among the saguaros and the other cactus clumps. Worse, he had carried Jim's saddle, pack, and water canteen with him. Left with only his gun, Jim stared hopelessly for a few moments, then started on the run, hoping to overtake the horse. The course led northward, and as Jim kept up his pace, the dust cloud dwindled, but there was no sign of the horse beyond it. Instead of slackening speed, Lubeck had kept on outdistancing Jim at such a degree that now the desert had swallowed the horse without a trace. Jim passed, mopped his sweating forehead, and then began calling for Lubeck, but his voice choked in his dry throat. Desperately, Jim plodded onward, managing to call at intervals, but finding the cause increasingly hopeless. Finally, when ready to drop in his tracks, he looked up at the sun and judged that he had wasted at least 3 hours in his hopeless quest. No sign of the horse, and now there was no turning back. For even if he found the faint trail again, it would bring him only to a dry water hole at the halfway point of a journey he knew he could never make on foot. In in that moment of utter desperation, Jim Gilbert had one grim solace: his revolver. It still had bullets in it, and when the time came that he could trek no further, not nor stand the anguish of his already tormenting thirst, he could be heard. Oh, wait. Here. He could at least cut the agony short. A bullet through his brain would do it, and Jim had heard it recommended as the only procedure for a plight like this. He tried to struggle on, only to settle hopelessly in the sand that seemed thicker, hotter, and even its clutch that of a living monster. Then, as he swallowed hard and tried to call again for Lubeck, a quiet voice interposed. "Well, it looks like you've gone and lost yourself out here." Jim turned and blinked at its speaker, wondering where he could have come from. He saw a solemn, weather-dried face beneath a wide hat brim, and decided that the man must be an old-time prospector. He certainly knew his way around the desert, for, like Jim, the stranger was on foot, yet showed no sign of physical exhaustion. "Yes, I've lost my horse." Okay, wait a minute. Where was it? "Oh no, yes, I've lost myself, sorry," gulped Jim. "And I've lost my horse, too. I don't know which way to go, on ahead or back to the trail." "Go on ahead until you find a water hole." 48. "But I may not find one, and if I do, it may be dry, and anyway, I'll be lost that much worse, and still without my horse." No, you'll find your horse waiting for you, son." Jim blinked. He could still see the man's face floating there, but the rest of his figure seemed all blacked out due to the effect of the sun on Jim's eyes. The man's expression, like his tone, was sympathetic, but Jim could not quite make sense from what he said. "You mean, if I find a watering hole, you'll find your horse. You're new to the desert, son, or you would know that a horse will go for a water hole whenever he needs it. Some of them are right smart in finding water, too." "They got horse sense," Jim managed to grin despite his predicament. Then glumly he added, "Only I don't have it. I wouldn't be here if I did, so without my horse to guide me, I can't find the water hole where you say my horse is." "I know the desert pretty well," the solemn man rejoined. "Maybe I can steer you there. Come along, son." He reached out a hand and as if to help Jim on his feet, but by then Jim was up and struggling forward. He managed to keep side by side with his older companion, who maintained a slow but even pace, pointing with his hand whenever he wanted Jim to turn in another direction. To Jim, it seemed that they were zigzagging all over the desert, but the sun was low now, and Jim's brain at least was clearer. He could see the old-timer full figure now, the black outline against the desert's white. And then, as Jim was meeting the stranger's steadying gaze and noting the fixed but sympathetic smile upon his lips, the man spoke in his same even tone. "Look straight ahead of you, son." A horse neigh, greeted Jim as he obeyed. There was Lubeck at what looked like a water hole. As Jim urged himself on, the horse pawed at the ground, dipping its head, and took a drink. Arriving there, Jim found a muddy ooze, and that satisfied Lubeck, and that the horse seemed willing to share, but Jim settled for a drink out of his canteen, which was still hanging from the saddle. Then, remembering the stranger who had guided him here, Jim turned. "Sorry, friend," he said apologetically. "I should have offered you a swig first. How about one now?" Jim proffered the canteen, but the man shook his head. I'll be heading along, he said. I haven't far to go. Tomorrow you head that way, to the north. Jim looked in the direction indicated, and the prospect was indeed inviting. In the midst of the desert, he could see the sheen of blue water glistening from far away. He studied it for several minutes, telling himself that it could only be a mirage, and suddenly it faded. Jim turned again to the stranger, only to find him gone. Momentarily, Jim wondered if he had been a mirage too. Then Jim laughed at his own folly. While he had been gawking toward the north, his benefactor had left, as he had been about to do, in the deepening shadows now thrown by the surrounding cactus plants. It would be as hard to trace a walking person as Jim had found it. Okay, wait. Sorry. It would be as hard to trace a walking person as Jim had found it to track his running horse a few hours earlier. That night, Jim tethered Lubeck and rolled himself into a blanket, for the desert night was growing cold. After an hour of looking at the clear stars, he drifted into a comfortable sleep. When he awakened after what seemed like several hours, he found himself staring into the starlight again, but his view was partially obscured, and when Jim saw why, a chill gripped him. Looming above him was a figure, swaying slightly, as though ready to deliver a downward gunshot or a knife thrust. The shape seemed ghostly at first, then Jim's mind jumped back to the stranger who had guided him here. He could almost picture those eyes boring down at him with a smile, no longer sympathetic but cryptic. No wonder the stranger hadn't far to go. He had simply eased from sight among the saguaros and bided his time for murder until now. But why? As Jim lay there, the perfect victim, keeping motionless only to prolong these last few moments, he suddenly had an answer. He felt a light touch on his neck that could have been a ghostly breeze emanating from a phantom finger, but reason told him that it must be the probing glide of human fingertips. Bare hands were locating Jim's throat so as to strangle him and leave him here, apparently a victim of thirst beside a dried out waterhole. No bullets, no knife wound, just the inevitable death that came to those who strayed from the trail and headed north. Now the indefinable touch was gone, and though Jim's frantic mind ran another thought, Bert Tolliver, all that talk of breaking up of the need for one to establish the claim while the other worked the mine was simply a clever means to an end, and to an evil end rather. Questions galore flocked through Jim's harassed brain. Had Bert sent him out into the desert where the smiling stranger waited? Were the two in cahoots, hoping to get rid of Jim? Had Bert warned against heading north, figuring that Jim would go against his advice? Had Bert started an argument with that very scheme in mind? Could the killer, whose strangling hands were ready now, be Bert himself? Could Bert have come along and overtaken Jim on the trail? If so, how did the stranger figure? One bigger question shouted down all the others. Jim seemed to scream to himself aloud, "What am I doing lying here? What am I doing?" He should be doing anything but lying there, a helpless victim. Unfortunately, Jim's gun was in his saddlebag, and his holster was with his holster. But he still had hands of his own, and he could strangle too. That thought brought action. With a sideward roll away from the figure who crouched above him, Jim struggled to get free of the blanket and attack on his own. It was like getting out of a straitjacket before Jim managed to work free of that troublesome blanket. He could have been shot or knifed a dozen times, but all the while the threatening figure remained immobile a few yards away. By the time Jim managed to get to his feet, he saw that it was neither ghost nor human. It was a horse. His horse. Lubeck had slipped his noose during the night and had wanted company. He had strolled over and gone to sleep standing up with his nose dipped almost to Jim's chest. Viewed upward from below, the horse's head and neck had looked exactly like a human form in the starlight. The touch that Jim had mistaken for a ghostly breeze or the approach of strangling fingers had merely been Lubeck's friendly nuzzles. Relieved, Jim patted the horse, tethered him again, and went back to sleep. Soon, dawn was streaking the sky, and Jim arose and made ready for an early start. He saddled Lubeck and laughingly told the horse, "Did you hear what the old-timer said? Go north." He was a mirage himself. The way he tried to lure me on. I'm going to go by what Bert told me, because Bert is okay. So today we will go back to the trail and follow it the way Bert told us. Jim was turning the horse southward while he spoke, but now he paused and he noticed something odd in Lubeck's gait. Jim sprang from the saddle and studied the horse's hoof. Jim's sudden fear was right. Lubeck had lamed one forehoof either during his mad gallop or while pawing at the water hole. It didn't matter which. What did matter was that the horse could not go on, at least not any faster than Jim himself. The old-timers' parting words rang through Jim's brain like the clear chime of a bell. Tomorrow you head that way, to the north. That was the only way. Already Jim had figured that it would be suicide to return alone and on foot to the waterless cross trail. With Lubeck badly lamed, the result would be the same. Having come this far north already, the only hope would be to go on. Trusting in the stranger's advice, Jim took the bridle and clicked. "Come on, Lubeck." They went on northward all that day under the burning sun, plodding through sand that was growing deeper, taxing Jim more than it had the day before. Jim gave Lubeck his head, hoping the horse might find another water hole, but with no result, Lubeck preferred to let Jim lead him. By dusk, they were both exhausted. How many miles had they come? Jim did not know, except that they were too few. But as Jim stood there, ready to make camp in the gathering desert twilight, a voice from beside him, "Tomorrow, son, keep heading north." It was the same stranger. With the same smile, Jim saw him clearly now, the long face beneath the wide-brimmed black Stetson. Below, black shirt, black trousers, black boots, all silhouetted against the dimming sky. Then darkness happened again, and the figure was gone. Another dawn, another trek. Jim leading his patient horse along, kept staring dead ahead, as in a dream. He saw a blue lake, green woods, vistas of towering cities beyond. Jim kept asking the plodding horse, "Do you see them too, Lubeck?" And the answer kept coming, yes, 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 in the form of steady nods, the result of the horse's slow, painful gait. But always each alluring scene was gone when Jim blinked and looked again. At last there was only one thing that he could see floating there ahead of him, the face of the smiling stranger. Then the man's full figure formed itself again, all in black. Gesturing forward, he said, Keep heading to the north." "Tomorrow," panted Jim. We head north, Lubeck, and I, tomorrow, son, right now, head north now." Jim was sagging in the sand with Lubeck ready to settle beside him, but he came to his feet now, tugging at the bridle, repeating, "Head north now." As they wobbled on together, horse and man, then Jim's disjointed thoughts began to express themselves in panted phrases. "Look ahead, Lubeck. Mirages. That's all. All we will see. Lakes, woods, cities. You never get to them. They all go away, and all you see is the horizon. A thin black line, Lubeck, and you never get to it either. One long line, straight across. No, two lines now. Laughing crazily, Jim tugged at the bridle, steadying himself thanks to the horse. Then, stumbling on, he kept saying, two lines now, a high one and a low one. You take the high line, I'll take the low line. They're spreading more now, one higher, one lower. We'll get to one horizon. The low one, the one near us, even if we never reach the high one, the far one. It seemed a crazy, meaningless struggle, but Jim kept it up, for he and Lubeck were no longer alone. Beside them was the stranger from the desert back again, his words monotonous, turned to the ringing in Jim's ears. Keep on going. Keep on going. Keep on, son. Keep on. The ringing drowned the words, and when Jim looked toward the man, he saw only a black blur beside him. But when he stared ahead, he could still see that close horizon, a broad black streak now straight across the desert and right in front of him. It glistened in the sunlight, so it would have to be a mirage, but it was close, so close that Jim was sure that he could reach it. Then he was desert, be a mirage, but it was so close that Jim was sure he could reach it. Then he was actually there, gasping gratefully as he sank to the ground, closing his eyes against the blinding sun and still clutching Lubeck's bridle as the horse stood patiently with lowered head. A weird wail came from the distance, shrilling louder, closer each time. It was repeated. With it, Jim was conscious of a roaring sound. He opened his eyes and looked along the line that he had mistaken for a horizon. Now he saw what it was, a railroad track, its steel rails stretching straight across the desert. The shriek was from the whistle of the locomotive that was thundering in Jim's direction, its black smoke clouding the desert sky. As Jim came to his feet and waved his arms, the engine chugged to a halt. The crew of the work train jumped to the ground and helped Jim into the caboose. They gave Lubeck a pail of water and led the horse up an improvised planking into an open boxcar. The locomotive started, and the train was under way again. While they were rolling toward the town of Monad, Jim learned the surprising facts behind his lucky rescue. He had stumbled upon a new branch line that had been pushed across the desert to reach the thriving gold fields. The work had been done within the past few months while Jim and Bert had been exploring the Skeleton Mountains. Hence, Bert's advice against heading northward had been sound, so far as he had known. Now Jim's concern was for the solemn stranger who had guided him to safety in the very middle of the desert, where other persons previously had perished from thirst and exhaustion, but none of the train crew had seen anyone answering to the description that Bert gave. From their smiles, it was plain that they doubted such a man existed. After a few days' rest in Monad, Jim hired a crew of mine workers and crossed the desert on a train, unloaded horses, mules, and equipment. Then trekked down to the claim that Jim had registered. There, Bert had uncovered another old mine shaft, and soon they were bringing out loads of pay ore. When the mine was on its organized basis, the partners put a superintendent in charge and made a trip to Topaz City to close out their business there. Stacks of mail had accumulated, and while Jim was going through the letters, Bert entered the studio and stared at a canvas resting on an easel. Bert's tone carried a note of awe as he said, "When did you paint that, Jim?" Over in Monad, replied Jim. While I was taking a rest, I didn't finish it there, but I've been adding bits from memory every now and then. From the way you're looking at it, I must say, I'd say it reminded you of someone. It sure does. Why, it's the old deacon, to a dot. The full-length portrait showed a solemn man with a faint smile on his weather-beaten face, and his hair was completely hidden by the broad brim of his black Stetson, black trousers, black boots, black shirt open at the top, completed his attire, forming a sharp outline against the desert background, which Jim had also painted. Understanding dawned in Bert's gaze as he queried, "You mean this way? You mean this was the old-timer, the stranger who told you about the man who met the stranger who told me about? The old man who met you out there and told you to keep heading north?" "That's right, Bert." "I should have known. You must have had the deacon on your mind the way your face showed in those mountain scenes you painted. You were sure to see him someday, and you did. Then you needed him. Then, when you needed him most, out there on the desert, seems to me he must have been with you all along, Jim, looking out for you." I know he was," declared Jim solemnly. He wanted us to find the mine, and he wanted me to live so that I could keep my share." Jim picked up a letter from the table. "This came from my Aunt Ethel," she said. She enclosed a picture from a lot of the family photos. The only one she couldn't find was of my father, and she was sure it was taken not long before he died. Here it is." Jim handed the photo to Bert, who studied it in amazement. It was the face of the painting, the face of the man Bert had known as the deacon. The same man Jim had met in the desert. "I should have known it then," Jim said softly. He said, "Keep heading north, son." And when he said son, there was something in his voice that made me think he meant it. And now, there was a choke from Jim's own voice. Now, I know he really did. And I'm sorry this one was a little bit long, but we just finished it up. We finished up the story. Anyways, we've been reading from The Ghost Town Ghost. It's from Rod Serling's Twilight Zone, 26 Unforgettable Explorations into the Realm of the Supernatural it's adapted by Walter B. Gibson. Now, thanks for watching, everyone, and if you like this content, make sure you like and subscribe and ring the bell so you know when I upload. Also, want to support me in any way. If you want to join the Discord server, all the information will be in the description below. As always, thanks for watching, everyone, and have a great day.